Hello and welcome everyone. So today's session will be on Introduction to Logic and Critical Thinking. It will be taken by Mr. Shah Majumdar, who will also be your mentor to a few of you in areas related to international relations, political economy, etc. If there are any questions, you can put them up in the chat box and we'll make sure they're addressed at the end of the session. Now Shah sir will take forward from here.
Right. All right. So, good morning, guys. So, the way this entire activity will be structured and the way we're looking at how we proceed today is I'll be taking you through the idea of what logic is and looking at answering some of the most basic questions about formal logic and giving you a general push towards the idea of critical thinking and what it stands for and how it works. Now, before we begin, I want to be very clear that we're not looking, or let me begin by saying that we're not going to be following the very philosophical or very technical aspect of formal logic. Instead, we're going to be looking at it in a more practical sense that's going to be useful for you in various academic disciplines and overall in following, let's say, a trajectory of critical thought in any kind of career or any kind of field you want to begin with. Now, when we look at logic, right, it's one of the most fundamental questions that you can ask is what is logic and why is logic necessary for building value or adding depth to, let's say, argumentation and so on and so forth. Now, there are many standardized definitions of what is logic, and I could give you a very technical definition of how logic works, but those are very useless, honestly speaking. Instead, let me look at the birth of logic and why logic is so important to us as human beings and why it's a natural counterpart to one of our basic traits that you must have encountered as children in school or you'll have heard about in popular culture or it's just generally very out there. So I'll be very surprised if you haven't heard of this idea, which is the idea of human curiosity. At some level, our quest for knowledge, whether it's philosophical, ethical, metaphysical, any kind of knowledge overall, is basically predicated by our desire to learn and inquire. Human beings have been asking questions about the nature of the universe, about various things around them from when we can see in recorded history. We've tried to ask these questions. Now, logic is basically a natural counterpart, a corollary to the process of going about answering these questions. So today, if I ask you a question about anything in particular, logic is that process that we will use, or more correctly, logical reasoning is a process that is used to attempt to answer those questions in a structured manner. And that's really where the key aspect of formal logic comes into play. Formal logic is a branch of logic that looks at developing structured reasoning and structured approaches so that you can, for example, make optimized approaches to answering questions instead of randomly trying to answer questions or going about rambling about ideas and concepts. In that way, formal logic can be taken as a precursor to a lot of modern subject domains like mathematics, for example, or the scientific method overall, because it is the prototype. It is, and in many cases, it is the originator of key ideas that will eventually develop down the years in history into the methods that we follow today or the methods that were followed in the past and have now been succeeded with more complex ideas. And I'll talk about that in a little later part of this webinar. To begin with, we need to explore the basic units of formal logic, which is the concept of an argument. Again, in basic principle, I'm sure that all of you have a layman understanding of an argument. You are well aware of what an argument is and how it works. I'm sure a lot of you who are, let's say, for example, been part of debates, or if you've been part of any circle of social media that looks at looking at comparing things like even TV shows or political ideas or anything that is essentially on the internet that has multiple perspectives, angles of interpretation to it, you will come across a debate, you will come across arguments, and so on and so forth. So what is an argument? What do we mean when we say that this is an argument and therefore there is a conclusion, and so on and so forth? Let's break down these terms. The first term that you need to look at is the concept of a premise. The premise is the basic unit of an argument. It is the oldest, if not the most used element of formal logic, which is basically you're looking at assertions. At fundamental levels, premises are assertions. They are assertive statements. There are other kinds of premises that can exist, but in the most basic sense, in the most commonplace sense, you have assertions that have a truth value attached to them. What do I mean by a truth value? Truth value simply means that an assertion is a statement that can either be true or it can be false. For example, a statement such as "it is hot today" is either true or it is false. There are no other potential options, or there are no other potential values that a statement like this can occupy. Similarly, if you look at a statement such as "it is raining," so therefore again it is either raining or it is not raining. So these are truth values. They determine the true nature of a statement, whether it's true or false. Now, premises make up the basic backbone of an argument, and they develop to something that we call an conclusion. Now, conclusions again are statements you will have encountered in your daily life and usually begin with things like thus, therefore, hence, proved, and so on and so forth. The idea of a conclusion is something that has evolved over the period of history, but in the most basic sense, a conclusion is derivative of the premise. So if you have two premises, there will be, for example, a conclusion that is based and derived from those two, for example, assertions. Now, the thing is, as I said, premises can be multiple kinds of statements. In most common formal logic, or at least the most usual form of formal logic, is where you use assertive statements, basic assertions, and basic assertive language. However, there are other kinds of for other kinds of statements that can also be premises. For example, questions that can occupy a truth value. For example, an interrogative sentence that can have, for example, a truth value is usually considered valid for, let's say, being a premise. So questions that have a yes or no answer more specifically is what we're looking at when we say that it can be a premise. Similarly, imperatives, any kind of command, for example, things like "you will respect my authority" or "you will respect my decision," is considered as a premise, a valid premise, simply because you can either choose to respect the authority or decision, or you can choose not to respect the authority or decision. So you can have a truth value, it'll either be true or it'll be false. But things like exclamations, for example, like ouch, or like any kind of emotion that is being expressed, doesn't have a truth value. Similarly, in general, the idea of now is very important to bring in the concept of sentiment. So, what do I mean by sentiment? Logic usually works at a level outside of sentiment, outside of emotion. And remember, this is where I told you that it is in many ways the precursor of things like the scientific method or mathematics. The reason I brought that up, the reason that that was included, is because if you look at mathematics or science at a fundamental level, you will begin to realize that these are the subject domains associated with the idea of objectivity. But in more common terms, these are the subjects that relate to the idea of rationality, or what is known as rational behavior. What do I mean by rational behavior? Rational behavior is again a very large rabbit hole in terms of philosophy. There are people who still do PhDs in the idea of rational thought. There is, for example, subject domains like economics, behavioral economics that deals with rational behavior, irrational behavior, so on and so forth. So that's something that can be studied at great length. But for the purposes of this webinar, what do I mean by rational behavior is very simply the behavior that can be looked at in terms of any structured layers of elements. Any structured attempt to break it down will break it down into constituent ideas and concepts in a manner that's easily identifiable and can be tracked. That is known as rational behavior. To give you an analogy, rational behavior is basically similar to looking at any kind of action as a summative action. What do I mean by a summative action? I mean that it is a sum of its parts, and that each of these parts is able to be identified from the conclusion or from the action taken. The very appropriate analogy that again comes to mind here is the idea of Lego blocks, and I'm going to stick with the idea of Lego blocks here because they're going to be important to explain how conclusions operate and the ideas that we will be covering in formal logic a little later. But basically think of rational behavior as basically a block based system where you can pick and choose, this is a red block, this is a blue block, and so on and so forth. Now the problem arises with irrational behavior and what I had just introduced to you, the idea of sentiment. Now, in general, human emotions are not very easily turned into quantifiable or qualifiable states. What do I mean? For example, a statement like he is happy does not have an inherently objective true or false value outside of self expression. So, for example, if you say he is happy and the person you're addressing, the character that you're talking to, says, yes, I am happy, then that becomes a statement where there is supporting evidence and therefore it becomes there can be a truth value that it is determined. But outside of that, a statement such as he is happy does not cannot have a straightforward yes or no answer because happiness as an emotion, as a state of mind, is not very easily turned into black and white structures that you can identify. Remember that this is also why modern fields of practice such as psychology and primarily the uh, branches of humanities that deal with processes like psychology and for example in international relations things like conflict have so hard a time in creating these indicators or creating these kind of structures because they are very complex. There is no real one solution fits all approach. It has to be tailor made. But in formal logic, unfortunately, this branch of philosophy is not designed to incorporate these kind of irrational patterns. Instead, we only focus on rational behavior, which is where the formula of premises leading to a conclusion and conclusions being able to reverse engineer their premises comes into play. Hence the idea of the summative argument, the fact that you can build a structure with Lego and then you can pull it apart to see the individual Lego blocks that made up the structure. So moving forward, now that I have talked about a conclusion and what it is, let's look at the two major kinds of formal logic that, again, I'm sure you will have encountered in your time in school or just generally, is the idea of the concept of induction and deduction, which are the two major branches of formal logic. In this webinar, we will primarily be dealing with deductive logic, and I'll explain why in just a second. But before we go into induction and deduction, we need to look at the concept of validity. What does it mean to say that an argument is valid or it is invalid? Now, before we look at the concept of validity, one thing needs to be very clear. When we look at validity and invalidity, these are what I would like to call as mechanical states. What do I mean by mechanical states? they are similar to the concept of truth value in the sense that there are only two possible options. It's a binary field of something being valid or being invalid. There is no middle ground available. Similarly, these are not qualitative states. That means that whether the argument is good or bad does not account for in this idea of validity. A bad argument can be valid, but there may be elements that make it bad. So please understand that in formal logic, like a lot of uh, subjects like law, for example, the idea of common sense terminology doesn't directly apply. So normally, when I say that this is a bad argument, you would want to believe that it's a bad argument because it is invalid. But that's not always true. The idea of good or bad is something that we can come to a little later as we progress down this chain of thought. But for now, validity simply means determining and analyzing whether an argument is uh, in place, it is valid, or whether it is invalid. Now, here I would like to break away, as I said, from the traditional approach to formal logic and introduce first the major types of arguments and then talk about how to ascertain their validity. The first kind of argument is the kind of argument that I have been talking about throughout this webinar so far, the summative argument, the argument that is the sum of its parts. This is also known as a linear argument because in a linear argument, there are, for example, there is one direction of meaning. You move from premise A to premise B to premise C and then finally conclusion, or however many premises you want to stack. The major crux here is that in a linear argument, the validity of the argument is determined by two major things. One, that if your premises are valid, if the premises themselves are true, then the conclusion cannot be false. So if a false conclusion is drawn from two valid or two true premises, the argument is invalid. For example, if you were to create a conclusion completely outside the scheme of what is being talked about, that becomes, for example, a argument. Consider a very simple example where I say oranges are either, let's say oranges are either fruits or musical instruments, and then I say oranges are not fruits or oranges are musical instruments. The idea here is that there is no way to determine a conclusion, first of all, simply because you have encountered a major problem. A major problem here comes in the idea of consistency. For example, if I say oranges are fruits and oranges are musical instruments, there the argument can be consistent because think of it very clearly. It is possible for the object, the orange, to be both a musical instrument and a fruit. There is nothing that actually prevents this from occurring. However, if I say that oranges are, let's say, musical instruments, and in the very next series I say oranges are not musical instruments, I have, and if both of these premises are true, that means that there is inconsistency because there is contradiction. An object can either be something or it cannot be something. In formal logic, they cannot occupy a middle ground state or this kind of free floating state. Therefore, it is impossible for them to essentially create a kind of consistent pattern from it. Now I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say that two premises are true, but the conclusion is false, and therefore in is not derivative of that kind of pattern of thought. For example, when I say the idea of London, let's say we take the city of London and we assert that the city of London is in England. Similarly, we assert that the city of, let's say, Delhi is in India. And then our conclusion is that therefore Paris is in France. Now look at this. The problem here is when you look at the conclusion, right? The idea of Paris being in France, the premises are true. London is definitely in England. New Delhi is definitely in India. However, The problem is that the idea of Paris being in France is unable to be derived from the premises. It is impossible for us to determine the validity of the conclusion from the premises stack. Therefore, the argument is invalid. It is in this case, as an example that I was giving to you of where premises can be true, but the argument is false. Before I move forward, are there any questions to anything I have said so far? If there are any questions, I'd like to take them before we move forward into the types of arguments. Everybody is clear on what I have said? I'm assuming that if there are no questions, I'll move forward. All right, seeing none, I will move forward. Now we're going to look at the types of arguments, and as I said, break away from the traditional picture of formal logic for a second before we go back to look at deduction and induction as processes. Now, in very simple terms, modern argumentation has moved away from this basic idea of linear arguments into something that we like to call as complex or non-linear arguments. Before we go into this, one very open disclaimer: there are many kinds of arguments. You can classify them. There are many systems of classification. There are many types and categories of arguments that exist, and if you want to explore them, please go ahead. There are lots of online resources that you can look at. But today, what I'm going to cover is a very broad, generalized understanding of the shift from linear arguments, which I will want to call as the conventional or historical approach to logic, to the modern idea of non-linear argumentation, which is what is often used today in structures of debating, whether in formal or informal debating. What do I mean by non-linear arguments? Remember that one of the basic aspects of formal logic that we have tracked so far is that premises work together, add together to create a conclusion, right? However, in a non-linear argument, the link between the premise and the conclusion is not dependent on the other premises. What this means is that the relationship between the conclusion and a single premise is what is important. Whether the nature of the premises themselves are interrelated is not part of testing the validity directly of the argument, and the argument can be presented as non-summative and derived from individual branches of premises. To give you clarity on what I mean here, one of the classic examples I'm going to take of a non-linear argument that can have interrelated causes, but also, for example, can be looked at from every single branch premise is the idea of terrorism, for example. Now, when I look at terrorism, and let's say I'm specifically talking about the causes of terrorism, I'm building to an argument that is trying to track the causes of terrorism. I can divide the causes into three basic, very simple categories: the social, the political, and the economic. Now, the more astute among you, the more knowledgeable among you will realize that the way these things operate in actual practice is that they are obviously interrelated, which is why you have, adjoined terms like socio-political or socio-economic, so on and so forth. But in some way, you can also look at these three as distinct branches of thought that do not need to be interrelated to sustain themselves. For example, I can look at social causes of terrorism and look at primarily, let's say, causes related to ethnic tension, to religion, to practices of civilization or order, such as, for example, the way a city is organized or the way communities are organized, what kind of community, what kind of religion, what kind of practice, so on and so forth. Similarly, I can look at political causes of terrorism when I talk about, for example, the way governance in a particular region works, political oppression, the kind of, let's say, system of government, whether it's an autocratic government, democratic government, whether, for example, there are political lobbies, is there, let's say, oil lobby, a gas lobby, let's say, an extremist movement, so on and so forth. I can also look at economic causes of terrorism, where I can primarily look at, let's say, the inadequacy of a market to sustain its population, the lack of opportunity, unemployment, so on and so forth. You can build so many relationships from these three distinct branches. Now, each of these branches is valid in its relationship to the idea of terrorism. I can move, for example, from the ethnic or ethnographic understanding of terrorism to as a cause of terrorism in its own right. Similarly, as I just said, that in most cases you are going to want to link one or two or all together and explore how they work together to collaboratively lead to the cause of terrorism. That said, the idea here is that it is no longer summative. It is instead closer to what you guys study in school. And I'm sure, again, this is something as a basic concept that you will have encountered, the idea of overlaps or the idea of the Venn diagram. Now, for some of you who have taken mathematics, and I'll explain it for those who have not, this is very similar to the concept of something you study in slightly more advanced math, although that's not very difficult, is the concept of set theory. The fact that there are multiple, let's say there's a set of data and there's another set of data and how they relate to each other. But in very basic common terms, outside of the mathematical analogy, a very basic idea is to look at a Venn diagram. All of us will basically be familiar with Venn diagrams. If you don't know the nomenclature, what I'm talking about, Venn diagrams are basically those diagrams of overlapping circles that show the relationship between two things. For example, people who are in A group, people who are in B group, and people who are in both groups. Now, for example, here, when you look at terrorism, the overlaps between social causes, political causes, economic causes are where those conjoined terms like socio-political, socio-economic, so on and so forth are created, right? That's the birthplace, the origin of these terms. Now, why is this important for you to know? Why is this a relevant factor for today's understanding of argumentation? Is because non-linear arguments have broken away from the fundamental flaw in summative logic. In summative logic, if a single premise is invalid, the argument is invalid. There is no way to, for example, proceed further. However, in non-linear argument, since everything is basically a branch, right? It's one independent track leading to a larger idea. The branches themselves do not all need to be valid. It's great if they are, but if one single branch fails, doesn't mean that all other branches automatically fail and the idea itself is invalidated. This is really, really important because non-linear arguments, if some of you have put the two and two together, are therefore more usable in contexts such as complex social issues or complex ideas that cannot be broken down into this linear pattern. Terrorism is an example. Another great example that you will encounter today, and it's part of the very, very regular conversation, is the conversation on political rights. The conversation on political rights, whether it be rights related to gender, rights related to civil rights, and so on and so forth, are complex issues. Therefore, even if one branch or one idea, let's say the historical validity of a claim, is made found to be untrue, and okay, there is no historical validity to this claim that this group of people are making, that doesn't automatically deflate the other issues that a population may be facing. To give you an example of this so that you can relate to it, look at, for example, oppression that is taking place in countries like the People's Republic of China. Now, of course, China is a hot topic, and I won't be looking at the hot topic angle of it. I'm only taking China as an example. You can very easily take the United States. You can very easily take a European country. God forbid, they were the most powerful colonizers at a time. You can look at any country that has a history of oppression. But let's look at China, and let's look at what China is doing in Tibet. Now, if I was to look at the historical claim of Tibet, and if let's say I found anthropological evidence or other socio-historical evidence that said no, the Tibetans did not in fact own this land, that they were not in fact the sole possessors, and this historical claim is untrue. The rest of the claims, their brutality in terms of state oppression, the forced disappearance, the lack of any kind of ability to self-publish, and yada yada yada, are all still valid, right? They do not become automatically invalidated, which means that the larger concern, the larger idea of oppression still remains at play. This is the beauty of nonlinear argumentation, and why, for example, nonlinear arguments have become very, very popular and very, very utilized in spaces like academia, or spaces like complex theoretical perspectives or practical implementation strategies on the ground related to a lot of policy, so on and so forth. That said, when we talk about this transition from linear to non-linear, one thing you all must take a step back and look at, it's not as if linear arguments have gone out of fashion. I simply mean that they have been succeeded by something that allows an operation or allows a kind of interaction linear arguments simply cannot hold. But linear arguments are still very much in play. In fact, most modern marketing, advertisement, the kind of things like calls to action, so on and so forth, are great examples of linear arguments. For example, when I look at comparative arguments that are created by companies, and very, very famously looking of ads like Samsung and Apple, the reinforcement, the mechanic to reinforce their product is often a linear argument. Similarly, a very, very common linear argument that is being advanced right now, that you can go check out after this session, is look at the WHO guidelines on arguing for social distancing or arguing for quarantine and self-isolation. The way they've presented why self-isolation is to be followed is a very classic linear argument. Why are linear arguments still so popular? Because, as I said, remember what I began the session with, right? The idea that that logic and logical reasoning are basically examples of quenching curiosity, of looking to answer questions in a structured manner. Now, the thing is that linear arguments, because they are simple, they're easily tracked, are also intuitive. People can follow linear arguments, people can easily understand and place truth values against linear arguments, which makes them more easy to digest. And therefore, there is still a lot of use of linear arguments in formal debates, in formal presentations. A lot of policy proposals are still linear, so on and so forth. Now, moving forward, let's get back to the topic of the two major kinds of validity testing, which is the deductive and inductive logic. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of theoretical detail because it's not really relevant to your practical understanding. But to give you an idea, the concept of deductive and inductive logic is very, very simple. When you look at deductive logic is what we were just following. The idea of looking at drawing inferences if you have, for example, sufficient reasoning to look at the premises and stack how the conclusion is created. That is a deductive form of logic, and that is what deductive logic is. Inductive logic, on the other hand, is looking at making generalizations about the nature of an argument from a quantifiable perspective. What do I mean by a quantifiable perspective? For example, you remember those questions in maths you used to get, where very famous questions in maths like, if one person is able to complete a particular task in X amount of time, 10 people will be able to do the task in this amount of time. This idea is what is inductive logic. And inductive logic is actually very, very often used in economics or other mathematical and statistical branches, which is why we are not going to be looking at inductive logic. More specifically, inductive logic is logic that deals primarily with generalizations. So therefore, you have, for example, the idea of moving from a bulk amount of data to a single conclusion that is valid for all cases. For example, if I say, let's say in January 1996, it rained in Paris. In January 1998, it again rained in Paris. 1999, again rained in Paris. Therefore, my conclusion is that every January there is rain in Paris. This is an inductive argument. I have taken a lot of cases of data, specifically the rainfall in January, and generalized that there will be rain in January all the time. The thing is that unfortunately, inductive arguments, and this is why they are two separate branches, you cannot really make any observations about the deductive validity of an inductive argument. Inductive arguments simply are the task of moving for from the general set of data to a conclusion that you are making as a generalization that applies to all. Now, to summarize, an argument is deductively valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Remember that this is the basic idea and it applies to both types of arguments, the linear and the non-linear. However, in the case of the linear argument, remember that if a single premise fails, if you have a premise that is weak, it is impossible for the conclusion to be valid. Again, this is something I'm talking about. Please understand that this is not the very formal, or rather I would say the correct theoretical understanding of formal logic. There are cases where, for example, it may be possible, so on and so forth. But in common terms, in terms of argumentation that is used in academia and used in general professional purposes, in a linear argument, if a single premise fails, the argument is invalid. Similarly, in the case where the conclusion that you're drawing from a non-linear argument is false, and even if the premises are true, then that argument is also invalid. In the case of non-linear arguments specifically, this often only happens where you basically create an idea that you are unable to establish a relationship with from the premises that you are trying to make. For example, let's say I'm looking at climate change, right? And I'm talking about climate change, and I say that there is a link between something such as cattle grazing. Of course, there is a link, but let's say there is a link between cattle grazing and climate change. Now, until I have a way to link these two together, and I'll get to what that way can be in just a second, but unless that way exists of tracking the path between these two ideas, the conclusion and the premise, until that path is established, this is an invalid sort of argument simply because I am unable to track that development. So this is something that has to be said, and this is the basic, very summarized version of what a deductive or what an inductive logic is. Again, I'll pause here. Are there any questions regarding what I have said or what needs to be like revisited before we move forward? If there are any questions, if we want to move forward, please let me know. Are there any questions? Right. Can I explain deductive logic through an example? Sure. So let's take a very simple example of deductive logic. Let's look at a sentence like, I'll give you a very hilarious sentence. If I say that all Tagores are goats, right? Or let me look at it in the negative sense. No Tagore is a goat. Clear? No goat is a shark. Clear? No Tagore is a shark is the conclusion of this particular argument. This is an example of deductive logic. The idea of no Tagore is a shark is derived from the premises that came before it, and you can identify the chain of thought and reasoning that, for example, went into creating this structure. Now, when we look at deductive validity, again, in formal logic, there are some complex ideas that I am not getting into, for example, current just immediately, because those are ideas that are philosophical and not really practically applicable. One of these things is the concept of the distribution of terms, which is basically remember I gave you that idea of Venn diagrams, right? So the distribution of terms is actually the concept that looks at breaking down every assertion into key terms and identifying a middle term that exists in both premises and is removed from the conclusion. The middle term is basically the catalyst that essentially creates the necessary movement to arrive at the conclusion. However, since we are not going to be exploring, or we are not looking at formal logic as a subject to study in itself, we are not going to be talking about these concepts of distribution of terms and so on. If some of you are interested in looking at formal logic for itself, for the theoretical aspect of logic, we can probably, I'll talk to people and we can set up a different module for that, because there's a lot of things there that are not going to be covered here, like notation. How do you standardize statements? How do you bring them into standard form, so on and so forth? That's very mathematical in its approach. Today we are going to be looking at it only in terms of the use it has in opening up avenues in, as I said, in academia or its professional use and so on and so forth. So does this answer your question? Do you need a further example? An example of a nonlinear argument. So I gave an example of a nonlinear argument when I talked about terrorism, but I will look at another nonlinear argument. Let's say, for example, you want to look at the idea of um, okay, let's look at, for example, an idea that is very, very hot topic right now. Let's look at the causes of racism, for example, right? Now, if I look at the causes of racism, I can broadly divide it into as many things as I want to. Let's say I divide the causes of racism or the birth of racism into three major trajectories: the historical causes, right? The economic causes, and the political causes, right? I've made it. Notice I'm ignoring social here for a very specific reason. I'll explain. Now, when I talk about historical causes, when I look at these three tracks, the historical, the economic, and the political, these three tracks in and of themselves are complete causes of racism. They can be used to explore the birth of racism completely without the need for the other two. The other two certainly add depth, certainly add more impact, and you can, go on in this line of thought, but they are not needed. They are not dependent structures. So I can look at the historical causes of racism, look at the chronology of how it occurred, the policies, the mindset, so on and so forth. I can look at, for example, the political causes, where I can talk about, let's say, ideas such as slavery, or even going back to like the birth of the city state. I can talk about the idea of conquest and what it means to be vanquished or conquered, so on and so forth. There are many ways I can approach this problem. This is a complex, a ambiguous, and amorphous issue. Now, each of these branches is independently leading to the conclusion. You can draw the conclusion from any of these premise branches. However, however, you can also interrelate the premises. Today, I can talk about historical and economic perspectives together. I can have a study of politics and history together, of racism, and so on and so forth. In many ways, the current trend, the current studies that you do make it impossible for you to believe that these things could be separate. But you would be shocked to know that for a very large part of human history, there was a huge aspect of Puritanism. There was an aspect of making pure subjects, of not relating subjects at all. But today, with modern understanding and with greater realization towards these kind of issues, we've come to realize that it is impossible to treat them outside of interrelation, which is why a buzzword of interdisciplinarity has been created. You see interdisciplinary all the time when you look at university courses, when you're looking at professional courses or anything, interdisciplinary approach, yada yada. Why does this interdisciplinarity come from? Interdisciplinarity is essentially one of those things that has benefited and also driven the birth of nonlinear arguments. I think that probably answers this question, and we can move forward. Are there any further questions before we move on to the next stage of this presentation? Anybody else has any questions? None? All right. So let's move forward into the next part of what we need to do. So now that we've looked at deductive validity, looked at deduction and induction as general processes of thought, the next step is to look at and start beginning to realize, for example, the need to look at digressions, and for example how digressions operate. What do I mean by a digression? And looking at reinforcements to the structures of logic. Now, remember that example I just gave when I said that if there is no connecting thread between, let's say, cattle grazing and environmental degradation, the argument is invalid simply because we can't really look at deducing, or we can't really follow a thread of thought. This led to the idea of research as a method. Now, this goes back to understanding how, for example, the logic and logical reasoning have contributed to the development of fields, and how, for example, fields split from philosophy in the first place. But one of the key things that you can look at is the idea of research being a mechanism, being a process that is used to fill in the gaps between this process of deductive logic and deductive inference making. Now, one of the things that, like, for example, you can talk about is, and I think this is one of the greatest misconceptions that exist, research is not just statistics, stats, and figures. Research also is the development of concepts, the development of, for example, further depth given to some ideas, and so on and so forth, which is why, let's say, you have the subject stream of commerce and the humanities, which thrive on this kind of research. To an extent, higher degrees of science, where you're looking at things like fuzzy logic and so on and so forth, also thrive on this, or algebra, for example, in mathematics, thrive in this kind of thought process. The idea of research here becomes a, I would say, a connecting piece. It's like a puzzle piece that I'm fitting together that allows us to reinforce and to create more sound structures of logic. Before I go forward and look at soundness, can anybody give me, for example, what what you generally understand when I say something is sound, when this argument is sound? What does it mean? Most people will associate soundness with simply the idea of an argument being valid. But what is if I have to ask you to pin down what makes an argument sound, and this is where I'll try and answer the question of good and bad. Can anybody tell me what are the features of a sound argument? What are the basic things that you would look for in a sound argument? Anybody? That makes sense. All right. Should be rational. All right. I'll take a few more responses. Go ahead. Please don't worry. There is no incorrect response here. In fact, all of you have been correct so far. Anybody? All right. Cannot be counted. Opposing argument should fail to disprove it. Not vague. All right. Tautological or truism. All right. I think I'm going to stop it here. Thank you for your responses. Right. Now, the thing is that all of you are partially correct. In fact, some of you have gone into greater depth than I would have thought of, the idea of tautology and truism, so on and so forth. The basic idea of soundness, of course, please note that the correct definition of soundness in formal logic is very simple. An argument is sound, or more correctly, a proof system is sound when there are no other proofs of invalid arguments. That means that when I want to demonstrate that a proof system is found, a sound, I need to show that any possible proof is the proof of a valid argument. Now, what does this mean in non-jargon terms for people to generally understand? Again, as I said, we are not looking at the theoretical perspective directly. We're looking at it in a more practical sense. What does this mean? What does this idea of proof system mean? Now, this proof system is a term that was earlier used to denote the idea of research in a time where science was the dominant field of rationality. Remember that there was a time, and I'm sure that if you go into the study of history, you will notice the periods of the science versus the church, so on and so forth. I'm sure some of you would know the example of Galileo, and we can discuss those in a webinar again when we look at philosophy and the history of philosophy. But for now, what do you mean by a proof system? In very simple terms, a proof system is exactly as it sounds. A structure I have created to prove if something is true or false. Remember that I said that there are truth values to statements, and similarly, for example, the idea of some kind of frameworks needing to exist to incorporate, let's say, certain irrational sentiments, so on and so forth, into logic. Look at, for example, the earlier example I had given to you where I had said that he is happy is a statement that I cannot assign a value to unless I actually find that he, whoever they may be, and ask them if they are happy, and if they say yes. This is also known as a self-mediated proof. What it basically means, it's actually interestingly trivia fact for all of you. This is also one of the basic ideas of attestation. When you say what does self-attestation mean, this is known as self-attested proof, where you are saying that yes, the fact that I am happy, I am attesting to, I am saying, and I am agreeing that this is indeed true. Now, that process of going to that person, tracking them down, and getting the proof is what a proof system is. It's a mechanism of attempting to figure out the validity of the truth value, my apologies, the truth value of a certain premise or a certain statement. Now, in simple terms, this idea of proof system gave rise to the modern connotation and denotation of research. What do I mean by the modern connotations of research? It is now what we understand as the layman idea of research. When I look at the word research, one of the words that immediately pops into my head is the idea of a proof. That yes, research is basically the act of creating and structured inquiry, finding proof for things, and proving what is now known as a hypothesis. Hypothesis is a term that is basically again a term that was coined later on in the development of the process of arguments, where everybody knows what a hypothesis is, right? An assertion that you believe to be true, and you work towards proving it by creating this proof system. I'm not going to dwell on this further. The point that I am trying to make is a simple one, that there is a great synergy between research and the ideas of arguments in terms of them being a form of giving structural depth and structural integrity to arguments. And some of you have also said in the chat, and I completely agree, this is where the concept of substantiation began. Before we look at substantiation, which is a slightly more advanced version, we need to tackle the idea of digressions, which is what I began this with. What do I mean by digressions? Now, digressions are essentially an aspect of a more modern understanding of logic, where we look at adding other components outside of the pure philosophical aspects of logic, things like other ideas, other concepts, historical data, contextual data, facts and figures, so on and so forth, are all examples of digressions. Why are they digressions? Because they are not part of the main chain of thought. They are not part of the main philosophical ideas. Going back to my example of the simple linear argument and simple uh, deductive argument. For example, when I talk about the no Tagore is a goat, the work that goes into proving that no Tagore is a goat is the research that needs to be carried out. Now, this is actually very simple to understand, and here I can also demonstrate an example of soundness in the proof system. What would be the proof system of proving that no Tagore is a goat? I need to first, of course, identify what is a Tagore and what is a goat. But let's say I have done that. There is a clear definition of X being Tagore and X being a goat. Now, once I have achieved that fact, my next step is to make sure that in my data, in my gathering and my ideas, I make it absolutely such that not even a single Tagore is a goat. As long as a single Tagore is not, like there is no Tagore that is a goat, my argument of no Tagore is a goat is valid. The moment a single Tagore becomes a goat, the argument, the premise becomes invalid because it is untrue. Do you understand what I'm saying here? The fact is, the proof system, the way the proof system will be designed is to make sure that the way we are looking at the data being gathered, all the data, all the observable, gatherable data, ideas, testimony, whatever you want to call it, is in a way that it shows that there is no single Tagore out there that is a goat. The moment we find one Tagore that is a goat, we essentially have lost the premise, we have lost the validity of the or the truth value of this particular premise. It has now been falsified. Some of you maybe recognize this idea also being used in science. For example, the ideas of theorems or laws come from this. The moment a law can be disproven by the single instance of it occurring, of a case that the law says it cannot occur, explicitly occurring, the law becomes invalid. So, for example, in the future, if there is a I'll take a very simple idea that all of you will have studied in very basic science, even if you didn't study science later, which is the law of conservation of matter, right? The fact that we cannot create, or more, let's not look at matter, the law of conservation of energy. That energy can neither be created nor destroyed, it can only transform, yada yada. But the moment we are able to create in a scientific sense energy, we are able to generate energy out of nothing, for example, this law becomes invalid because we have disproven the basic premise, the basic aspect of the law. This is important to understand because this is where you look at a good or bad argument. Good arguments are arguments that are sound because they come attached with a proof system, and those proof systems are something that you can explore. They are digressions that you can go into and you can explore their structure and then can gain confidence in the validity of an argument. A bad argument is an argument that is forwarded without any kind of proof system, without any kind of research. Now, it is here that we'll explore the first practical utility of arguments today, and I'll give you a very important example. The first basic example here is that um, these kind of structures and proof systems are actually in play in marketing, as I told you, where a lot of bad arguments are advanced without proof systems to persuade you into believing something. For example, the best kind, I know this is very weird as a formulation, but bear with me. The best kind of fake news or the best kind of propaganda comes by looking at creating structures of persuasions that you want to believe are true. They play on this idea of rationality, as I was telling you, of irrationality by making it seem rational, by gouging it into rational. To give you a simple idea, let's look at a statement such as the UNESCO has awarded Prime Minister Modi as the best Prime Minister in the world. I'm not going to talk about the political dimensions of this. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm simply interested in is as a person literate or erudite enough, you all know that this is untrue because the UNESCO doesn't have an award like this, right? There is no such kind of scheme of certification or distinction for heads of state. But the lay person, when they look at these pieces of data, they look at, okay, is Modi ji prime minister? Yes. Is the UNESCO an organization? What does it do? It says cultural organization. They are in there because of the absence of the proof system. They will look at the existing data. They will look at, okay, yes, the UNESCO is a cultural organization. This kind of certification does obviously can fall into cultural, in the cultural scheme of things, therefore it may be valid. This idea of manipulating the proof system either by creating the uh, what we call as tainted proof systems. I'm not going to go into the concept of a taint or bias, so on and so forth. But the idea of the absence of the proof system is a deliberate ploy in many advertising to essentially make you fall into the trap of that advertisement. Another very popular example of this kind of use in modern day is scamming. Why do people fall into scams? Why do very educated people also fall for scams? Because scammers create structures of argument that sound convincing, that sound, especially for example, advanced fee scams or scams that require you to donate for certain causes, etc., etc. These sound valid. They play into a modern mindset where they are able to persuade you, which is where we move to the next step of this webinar to look at how we can exploit the synergy of research and arguments by moving into the next stage of the development of logical reasoning, which is the process of critical thinking. Now, before we look at critical thinking, I'm not going to bore you with, yes, critical thinking is the great exercise of human imagination, so on and so forth, yada yada. This is not going to be something that I'm going to take very pedantically or very, formally. I'm going to look at critical thinking in a way that is beneficial to you right now and that you can start looking at right now. What is critical thinking? In very simple terms, critical thinking is an extension of that idea of asking questions. If logic and logical reasoning are processes and mechanisms to structure responses to our innate nature to ask questions, the idea of critical thinking is a furthering of the asking of those questions themselves. It's a way to make the questions that we ask better, and by making the questions better, the answers that we get are automatically better as well. How do we do that? A lot of you will have encountered the idea of, and this is a very popular culture thing right now, the idea of, for example, thinking out of the box. The idea to look at what is the concept of thinking out of the box, think outside and creatively, innovation, so many random words that are thrown at you, right? Now, before we look at this, we need to look at the idea of the concept that is known as the dimensions of thought. What do I mean by the dimensions of thought? This is one of those very fancy uses of language that seem very intimidating but really aren't. The concept of dimension of thought is very simple. And again, I'm going to, for all of you who understand set theory, the dimensions of thought are those that basically gave rise to the concept of the universal set. That set that contains absolutely everything. But for everybody else, what does a dimension of thought mean? The dimensions of thought are basically a study of more, they are essentially, let's say, closer to the modern psychological understanding of thinking than they are to the older philosophical one, but there is a tie-in with philosophy. The dimension of thought is basically the perspective that a person or group of people, a country, you can make it as broad as you want, but basically the way in which you think is set around a very key term, that is the idea of the constraint. What do I mean by the constraint? Every human being's perception is limited by something. That something is what you can evaluate. It can be limited by economic circumstances. It can be limited by political circumstances. It can be limited by their intellectual ability. and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that it is limited. No human being is omniscient. They are incapable of perceiving all data. They only perceive a part of data, which is where the concept of the dimension of thought comes into play. Why is the dimension of thought important? Today, you must be seeing that there is a huge pushback against educational practices like rote learning. Like you see rote learning being basically wrapped everywhere, where everybody is saying that this is bad, this is not how education should be, so on and so forth. But why was rote learning so popular to begin with? Why is it that it took so long for education systems to realize that the garbling up of data isn't the best way to develop, let's say, personality, character, and intelligence? The fact of the matter is that you can trace this back to various educational systems, and I'm unfortunately going to have to reference the Western systems of thought, because not only are they better documented, but also they became dominant due to the dominance in politics, the colonization period, so on and so forth. But even before that, there are alternative systems. For example, the Eastern systems, what are called the Eastern systems of thought, whether they are, you look at the older Chinese systems, you look at our own country, Indian systems of how pedagogy function, the Gurukul concept, the mentorship model, and so on and so forth. They are very different, but there is still some element of what I'm saying that is true. The idea is, for example, the concept of dharma is one thing that is usually looked at in dimensions of thought, but I won't get into the specifics of it. I'll just tell you what I mean by dimension here. The idea of the constraint, the fact is that when education was being given out, education was a process of imparting knowledge and a form of, let's say, thought process. Now, people realized in the very beginning that education was being created even in ancient Greece and even before that, that by giving away information and the ideas behind that information, there was a level of empowerment being made possible. The person receiving, the recipient, was gaining access and therefore being able to be empowered in a certain direct way. This was dangerous to politically established systems, especially authoritarian systems that worked on keeping the population ignorant and keeping them away from certain basic truth. So therefore, not only was education a highly regulated activity, it was also a highly elitist activity. It was not available to a large amount of people. As this broke and as we moved into modern civilizational processes, this basic idea of maintaining some form of, I would call it as homogeneity between the various levels of governance, of the way the world is perceived. Those kind of things gave rise to a certain idea of the correct education. And soon, this correct education actually made its way into other kinds of civilizational thought processes like science, where the initial idea of science was to actually be rebelling against, let's say, the church as a form of correct knowledge and exploring yourself the truth of the universe. But very soon, even those truths of the universe began to be consolidated in what we now know as textbooks, where a certain selectivity was employed. You can also call it censorship, that was employed to make sure that only the correct ideas were passed on. A good example here is look at mathematics, and I know I'm saying mathematics again. I'm personally very fond of the subject, but I'm using this because it's a great idea of looking at the transition of how formal logic philosophically made its way into an actual subject in the past and how that subject has evolved, right? So if you look at mathematics from the very young age that you're taught maths in India specifically, I'm not talking about people who learn maths abroad. If any of you had education outside of this country, this is not directly applicable to you. But in most British-led or Commonwealth systems of education, mathematics is often taught with for a very long time. In fact, for the entirety of your schooling, you are only looking at mathematics as a form of resolution with one possible outcome. There is only one correct answer. which is why when you have Olympiads or quizzes where there are multiple correct answers possible, people struggle so much. Why do you think people struggle in standardized testing that has more than one option correct? Because they are just literally not taught to think like that. In mathematics, you're always told, okay, you need to arrive at this pinpoint answer. But obviously, there are many ways to arrive at that same answer, even in mathematics. And this is something that people began to realize, that by curtailing or by limiting the ability of our children or of our recipients of education to think, we are damaging the idea of human curiosity to an extent. We are limiting the ideas of inquiry, and this is causing harm. Which is why sometime in the past, in the late 90s and the early parts of the previous decade, you had a revolutionary change in pedagogy, which is the process of what defines teaching, and you moved away from these systems of traditional thought to more, let's say, interdisciplinary, more curiosity driven sort of question and answer processes. It is here where the idea of the box was created. The box is an easy, convenient way for you to visualize the system of constraint. Whenever you are placed in a system that is very clearly defined, that limits your ability to ask questions either of itself or look outside of that scheme of things, that is the box. Critical thinking is one of those facilities and faculties of human thought that looks to break the box. It looks to go beyond the idea of the box, and hence the concept of out of the box, hence the terms like innovation, so on and so forth. Now, before we move further, there is one term that I would like to introduce to you, which is the idea of the fallacy. I won't be covering fallacies here directly because I intended to talk about syllogism and, for example, categorizations of logic. But as I was looking at this material yesterday, I realized that while, yes, I could teach you what a syllogism is, what a formal structure of argument is, those are not as relevant to all of you. They are relevant to some of you who may want to perceive them in their academic work. So therefore, again, fallacies in their very, very formal state aren't really useful to you. But I will touch upon the idea of a fallacy, and why I will do so, I'll explain in the next 2 or 3 uh, minutes. But the basic idea of a fallacy is fallacies are errors, as simple as that. They are common errors that occur in logic, in the structure of logic, and in the way you frame arguments. And arguments that are fallacious are invalid, and there are many categories of fallacies. So, two major categories of fallacy that I will talk about are the only ones that I think are very relevant to all of you. There are many other kinds of fallacies. If you are interested, we can have a session on, as I said, on the actual structure of formal logic in philosophy, and we'll talk about the many kinds of fallacies that exist. But today, let's talk about the two very common kinds of fallacies that exist. The first is the fallacy ad nauseum, or the fallacy of excessive repetition, and the fallacy ad populum, or the populist fallacy. Now, what is the fallacy of repetition? The fallacy of repetition is very simply this, that by repeating an idea again and again, it does not become more valid or less valid. Its truth value doesn't change, and it still needs to be deciphered. And the argument is not strengthened by repeating the same thing again and again. A version of the idea of the fallacy ad nauseum is when it turns into something that is known as a circular argument, where there is no conclusion. You essentially are paraphrasing the premises back and forth, and you are essentially repeating the same ideas again and again. Some of you will have encountered this early on when you were writing essays in school, where you're literally saying the same thing again and again. The problem is that this kind of fallacy, the fallacy of repetition, is very, very important for you to recognize, to not be socially engineered. What do I mean by socially engineered? Again, let's go back to that idea of marketing and the idea of how, for example, propaganda works. One of the major tricks of propaganda is to hide this repetition in creative ways. Today, if you're looking at, let's say, instigation of violence, or for example, looking at reinforcement of communal trends. One of the easiest ways to reinforce communal trends is to paint a certain population as evil. To do so, I will keep repeating that they are evil in creative ways. What are these creative ways? I can create pseudo-proof systems of biased data gathering. I can create pamphlets. I can create podcasts where I will have sob stories of just one side of the population, so on and so forth. The creativity is endless here, which is why it's important that you start learning about the fallacy of repetition and do not commit it yourself. Repeating the same idea and again doesn't add anything to your argument. A second and more important version of this is the fallacy ad populum. Just because a certain majority section believes an idea to be true, it doesn't become true. Today, if I believe and thousands of people believe that the earth is flat, doesn't mean that the earth is actually flat. Similarly, there are lots of people who believe that the Holocaust did not occur. Just because 100,000, 200,000, a country, two countries, three countries believe that the Holocaust did not occur, does not mean that the Holocaust actually did not take place. The problem here is the fallacy ad populum is one of those fallacies that is actually creatively used in politics to change your perception of the world. And this is again where the box comes in. These two fallacies are also part of what creates the box. They limit your understanding. To a large extent, these are like horse blinds. Those blinds you put on a horse so that it keeps going straight and doesn't really look around. That's the same thing what these fallacies try and do. They try and engineer your perception so that you move in that line that they dictate. So you need to be very careful and you need to recognize the existence of these fallacies so that you can begin to think out of the box. And the next part and the last part of what I'm going to talk about is exactly this, the concept of how to begin to start using critical thinking and develop critical thinking. Now, there are two major approaches to critical thinking that I will cover. The one of them is very easy. The second one is slightly more difficult because these two major approaches to critical thinking, as I said, remember I told you that critical thinking is essentially a process of asking better questions. Well, critical thinking tries to look at these questions in two ways. One is we try to ask questions of ideas that already exist. Questions like why, how, when, so on and so forth. Those kind of questions of data ideas that exist, for example, when did racism become a mainstream practice? Or when did X thing occur and why did it occur? So those kind of questions become part and parcel of what I like to call as diagnostic processes of critical thinking, or more correctly, the analytical approach. What is the analytical approach? Well, the idea here is the idea of analysis. In very simple terms, analysis, and this is where I go back to my Lego block analogy. Analysis is the idea of deconstructing, pulling apart the Lego block and examining each of the pieces separately. And how do you examine these pieces is depending on what you intend to do. You can frame inquiries and questions. Are you looking to gather the statistics data? And then you will have analytical frameworks that look at gathering statistical data. Are you trying to question their history, their politics, their economic relevance, so on and so forth? There is no one solution fits all approach to the idea of analysis. There are many kinds of analysis that exist. There are analysis by inspection, where you simply look at the structure of an idea and you're able to find a gap in it. There is analysis by substitution, where you try and change one part of an idea to see if it still works, so on and so forth. There are many, many kinds of analysis and systems of analysis. Again, if some of you are interested in learning these kind of analytical approaches, one of the future series that we can take building on this particular topic is systems of analysis. But for now, you need to recognize that analysis is synonymous with the process of deconstruction and assembly. You want to deconstruct the Lego pieces, the ideas, tear them apart, open them up, and examine how they tick, and assemble them back together and see how that assembly works, how they relate to each other, so on and so forth. That is the idea of analysis. to attempt to begin analysis, there are two things that you need to develop. The first is very simply observation. Try and learn to be more observant, to take notes of things that are happening around you. Try and list the components of any idea. Today, if you're working on a research paper or you're trying to look at something, even day-to-day decisions. For example, suppose I say that I want to buy a phone or an iPad, or I want to buy a video game, anything. All of these are very valid, very commonplace ideas, right? So I need to start looking at creating some form of approach where I begin to analyze. What is the analysis that I will want to use? The most obvious one is the cost benefit analysis, where I will say, okay, if I get this particular phone or if I get a new iPad, what benefits will it offer to me? What are the things that I will gain? And I will list them down in one bracket. Similarly, let's say what are the cons of this idea, what are the problems of or the costs of this idea, the amount of money I'm going to spend, the, let's say for example, the potential of getting addicted to this device, the potential of if I'm buying it on a credit card and I'm paying monthly installments, the potential of going into an economic burden. Similarly, for example, if I'm buying, let's say, a fancy iPad like an iPad Pro, one of the major cons would be, and this is very true for me, I don't know how true it is for all of you, but I'm a very clumsy human being. So, for example, if I'm a clumsy human being, I'm always going to be worried that if the bloody thing drops, it's going to break, and that's the investment down the drain. So, things like this, these very simple everyday uses of breaking things down into as simple an idea as cost and benefit. This is known as comparative analysis or cost benefit analysis, whatever you want to call it. You can always put fancy labels on these processes. But the basic idea is to deconstruct the core ideas, examine them through simple observation. Be more observant, be more attuned to your surroundings. The second thing that you can try and do to learn analysis is to explore and look at those digressions I was just talking about. Conduct research to look at how those puzzle pieces fit together. Now, for example, a very interesting counterpart to this idea would be, suppose I went ahead and said that I am going to get an iPad because the iPad allows me to read uh, in a more handy way and it's less cumbersome than carrying a laptop around. Very simple idea, very valid idea. Now, what I will do is, if I want to take this analysis up a notch outside of just observation, I will try and create a alternative structure. What I just told to you is to look at, for example, exploring the possibilities of looking at looking at the observations you have made and seeing if substitutes or there is more to the picture that can be had by looking and creating inferences. This is the next step of analysis, looking at inferences. One of the inferences is that my basic utility for the iPad is reading, right? The convenience I have in reading. Now, suppose I go and look up on the internet and I find that there are e-readers or there are, for example, things like the Kindle that exist that are significantly cheaper, at least the basic versions of the Kindle, right? Now, what I need to do is I need to start asking a question such as, if reading is my sole purpose, and let's say I don't really have any further great utility for the iPad, can I do with a Kindle? And if that answer becomes yes, then in that sense, I have moved away, I have used my observation to draw an inference that my needs can be met with another device that is significantly cheaper. In that way, I have analyzed and found a way of answering this question in a more economically beneficial manner, that I will therefore not end up spending this larger amount of money. This is essentially a very basic introduction to analysis. Again, remember that this is not a case that you can apply to everything. The idea that you need to know is the two things that you need to learn is observation, be more observant of the world, and the idea of inferences. Learn to draw inferences, learn to question the ideas that you have created by examining either alternatives, examining if those ideas themselves are sound, examining if looking at it, there are other systems that you can use to analyze the same situation, so on and so forth. What do I mean by that? I'll actually take the third example there, because this is actually the very, very common thing that's happening now. So let's say if I was to say that the iPad is going to be my primary music player, let's say. Or I know it's a very, very like unnatural case, but let's say I was going to say that the iPad will basically be a portable, version of storage for me, that I'll be able to store files and view them on the go. Now, what you need to look at is that there is an alternative immediately out there that exists, that is really being pushed forward right now, which is cloud storage, which is storage over the internet. This is where observation and inference merge. If I observe that I, as an individual, live in spaces where there is consistent access of internet in 95% of the time, I am at A place or B place or C place, and can have access to a laptop or to a system, so on and so forth. That means that investing in cloud storage might be again economically cheaper and has other benefits than an iPad. The iPad is a hardware-based device. If it breaks, I potentially risk the loss of data. But if it's available on the internet, and the internet is less likely to break, and therefore my data is more likely to be safe. These are ideas of, again, and this is another kind of comparative analysis, and this is again a way of merging observations and inferences together. Now, the last approach to critical thinking that we will cover today before I take questions is the schematic approach to critical thinking. What do I mean by the schematic approach? As I said, critical thinking is a process of asking better questions. Some of these questions are futuristic in nature. We want to plan and we want to have some control over the degree of variables that can happen. This attempt to control the outcome is again a very fundamental human thing. You will have seen it in so many ways in popular culture, whether it's the Disney animations or things like the Frozen movies with the exploration of the unknown, or let's say something like Star Trek or Space Odyssey or whatever you're into. But the question of the unknown, right? The fear of the unknown, to mitigate that fear of the unknown is a very human thing. To do that, many thinkers came together to create what we call as a schematic process of critical thinking. Schema here or schematic here basically means the ability to create a framework, the ability to create a system of, or what I just explained to you, a proof system that allows you to certain extents, mitigate the variable natures of the future. A very simple example of not necessarily critical thinking, but very, very obvious schematic thinking is, if I have a pet, or if I want to have a certain kind of food. Let's say I like having milkshakes. For that, I need milk. So if I want to have milkshakes, I need milk. My schema here is I will go and buy milk from the milk shop at this time before the milk runs out. This is a very, very basic level of planning, that I know I have put again together some observations, some data. I know that the milk shop in my neighborhood runs out of milk by X time. I need to go before X time so that I can get milk because I want to make a milkshake. These are all very, very obvious, very, very basic kinds of inferences, observations being put together into a schematic understanding of the world. What we have just looked at, the schematic form of critical thinking, introduces with it two major terms: the idea of a parameter and the process of variables. Variables are easier to understand, so let me explain. Variables are basically, as they sound, these are things that you can account for to a degree, but you do not know the end result of. In terms of logic, you do not know whether they will be true or false. In that way, I'm breaking away from formal logic, because remember, in formal logic, the truth value can be asserted. But these are things that, for example, you cannot ascertain the truth value of. A good example here would be things like developmental policy. Today, if I am a government and I create a scheme for the empowerment of, let's say, a lower strata of society, I cannot completely know whether that scheme will succeed. I can have a lot of indicators, a lot of work done to predict the success of the process, but I cannot 100% say that no other situation will arise that will actually make that scheme fail. A good example of this is the pandemic. Nobody predicted that a pandemic would occur, right? So today, if let's say I launched a restaurant, right, and I have everything for my restaurant, I'm launching a beautiful Mexican restaurant, gorgeous place, great prices, yada yada. I planned for everything I could plan for, but then this pandemic happens and my restaurant is forced to shut down. This is not something I could have planned for. So this is a variable, this is a thing that is always going to happen for futuristic planning or any kind of planning that is looking at the near future, the midterm future, so on and so forth. Then is the idea of a parameter. What do I mean by a parameter? In very loose terms, and I think it's going to suffice for us today, a parameter is essentially an objective. It is essentially looking at what I need to achieve. So, for example, in terms of my restaurant example, it could be the number of customers I want to have. It could be, for example, the kind of impact I want to have in a particular segment of the market, so on and so forth. But the idea is parameters are basically your version of constraints, your self-defined constraints that you need to achieve. My milkshake example here, the milkshake is the parameter. My end goal is to achieve that commodity, that product, the milkshake. So I will work towards getting that in order. Similarly, you will set parameters for things that you want to plan for. Today, for example, if some of you are planning for your future career or your future education, you will want to look at these parameters. These parameters could be as simple as I want to earn this amount of money, I want to work in this country or in this space, so on and so forth. You could have more complex parameters saying that I want to gain, I want to participate in a job that I gain personal enjoyment out of. That is something that's satisfying. These are more complex philosophical, emotional objectives that are not easily accounted for with just data, statistics, ideas. You need to therefore plan or have a greater degree of observation, have better proof systems, have better structures and in play to sort of go about achieving the answers to these parameters. So therefore, these are known as parameters. And at the end, the entire process of schematic critical thinking rests on one fundamental idea. That fundamental idea is essentially the idea of estimation. Learning to make a framework using calculated predictions, then some amount of guesswork. But that guesswork is usually well informed. This is what I said by the difference between, let's say, guessing and prediction or guessing and estimation, which is where you will have some understanding and some, let's say, prior data to going about creating the parameters and learning to mitigate the variables. This is where I tie in one of the things that we have left little bit on the sidelines is inductive logic. Remember when I said that inductive logic is often used for generalizations? Inductive logic makes a comeback in modern society in this kind of critical thinking. A lot of your processes of creating or mitigating variables will be based on inductive logic, because you will look at patterns of thought. You will be like, okay, one of the things is, suppose if I'm planning for a trip and I want to go to a particular place, let's say I want to go to Paris, or I want to go to Berlin, wherever, and I say, okay, the cost of, let's say, a bus in Berlin and an average is 2 or 3 euros, and this price has remained similarly, like it has only risen by an X amount for the past 5 years. So in the 6th year that I am going, I can assume that, with the current trend, it will increase by Y amount. So I will account for, let's say, if I have to take 5 or 6 bus rides in a week or 10 bus rides in a week, I will budget my travel accordingly, right? So this is a way of estimation. And as I said, sure, there are variables. The bus price may fluctuate for no reason that you can account for. But as long as you do your best, put your best foot forward in essentially trying to look at limiting, for example, your uh, variables at play by filling in the gaps using the data and using the observations that you can possibly make, you're going to be fine in a majority of cases. So that's the last thing that I wanted to cover today. And tomorrow you will probably go into the more practical approaches of logic and reasoning and see how they apply to real fields of study. but this is my complete introduction to the idea of logic in its current state and the basic way of starting to think critically and understanding how critical thinking operates. So that's it from my side. If there are any questions, I'd like to take them now. Are there any questions for anything that I have said? All right, so I think that there are, right, or at least I don't see any questions. So I think with that, we have come to the end of this relatively long hour and a half session. If we get the chance, I hope some of you will get to interact with me again and we'll take up more specific lines of thought. Again, please showcase your interest to the members of the IYEA if you want to see more specific or more formal discussions on formal logic in terms of a theoretical approach, or if you want to look at systems of fallacies in a more organized and more detailed fashion. Those are things I'm sure we can make happen later on. But that's it from my side, guys. Thank you for attending. And I think I'll let the host take over from here. So, Aman and Kishika, it's back to you.
Thank you, Shar sir, for such a fruitful session. Thank you everyone for joining in. With this, we will conclude this session.